people of ancient times were so entirely different than modern humans. Yet, they were so similar. So often do we read the stories of the past and entirely miss their point due to our own modern biases. Even more often do we forget what these stories actually meant to the people of that time. Modern adaptations allow us a window into ancient stories and mythology. This window, however, is slightly shifted. There have been many old religions that have gotten modern revivals, but those often overemphasize or overshoot the goals of the old religion and misrepresent the ancient religion entirely. Using a term I mostly made up called modern mythology, we can parse through what is true to the ancient stories and what is not. Modern mythology has the difficult task of respecting the authenticity and value of the religion they replicate while also connecting with a modern audience. The video game Hades perfects this window. Not only does it incorporate many of the ancient mythological key points, but it also incorporates many of the modern mythological points. The most obvious manifestation of Hades' incorporation of mythology is in their depiction of the gods. Every god follows the trait assigned to them by Greek mythology. They act the same, wear the same clothes, and have similar powers to their ancient counterparts. Conflict between gods is incredibly common in Greek mythology, and this is found throughout Hades. Gods often make jabs at each other, some of which will be further discussed later. But most of all, they are all trying to get an edge above each other, either to impress Zeus or, more likely, to their own end. Speaking of, Zeus is depicted in this game with a lightning bolt, a crown of lightning, and wearing a very revealing toga. The lightning bolt is often associated with Zeus in Greek mythology, and although the majority of the crown is lightning, there is a small patch of olive leaves above his head which also echo ancient mythology. Zeus is usually depicted wearing a lot more clothes than this, but this game intentionally made their characters look epic and beautiful, and justifiably so, as this style was incredibly common for the portrayal of gods on statues in ancient times. So far, through analyzing Zeus, we can see that the game attempts to incorporate every aspect of the ancient god. The only things that are different or left out have reasons to be that way. Nothing is accidentally missing. This is true for the entirety of the game. Conflict between the gods is manifested in many ways. Most notably, it is within the very crux of the story that a conflict unravels. Zagreus, who is the lead character of the game, being the one that you play, has questions about his origins. In Greek mythology, Zagreus was sometimes known as the son of Zeus and Persephone, but they don't go with that interpretation during this game. In Hades, Zagreus is the son of Hades. It should also be noted at this point that there was a stigma around talking about Hades in ancient Greek culture, which had allowed the devs to be more creative with the creation and development of the character. The way in which the game justifies Zagreus being the son of Hades is through the gods telling them that they did not know of his existence before, that Hades had hidden his existence.
It's such a cruelty that your father hid the knowledge of your birth and life from us, my cousin. It's unacceptable.
Hades is seen in this game at a desk, filling out paperwork. He has a long beard and long hair. Notably, they decide to place Cerberus next to him. This fits quite nicely with the common depictions of Hades in ancient mythology, placing his three-headed dog to his side. Anyways, Zeus is quite angry with Zagreus, viewing him as lazy and wasteful, and Zagreus perceives this, and also understands that people treat him differently because of his green eye, which does not run in Hades' bloodline. Suspicious of this, Zagreus finds out his mother is not Nyx, but Persephone. This further deepens the conflict in the story, and of course affairs like this are extremely common in Greek mythology. While the stories of Hades often show us how hateful the gods can be, in the end it is shown to be happy. Some might think that this on the surface is unrealistic for the Greeks, as there is almost always trouble and division. But I believe it is not only a good place to end a story, but it also more heavily relates to a deeper idea in Greek mythology, that these gods all live eternally with each other. No matter how much they dislike each other or want to kill each other, they can't. Unlike in Norse mythology, these gods aren't bound to die. They're bound to coexist. An unhappy ending in Hades would be entirely predictable, and moreover, it would be misplaced. Greek mythology is not all about hate, even if it seems that way to a modern observer. The absence of Persephone at the beginning of Hades is somewhat jarring, and as you learn more about your own story, it becomes clear that something is amiss with mythology. While it is not completely irregular for Persephone to be missing, being something which is portrayed in many stories regarding them, both ancient and modern, her absence is noticeably strange to anyone which loves the mythology. The story between Hades and Persephone goes very deep. Persephone is the daughter of Demeter, who is an overly protective mother. However, there is a difference in the myth and the story of the game here. Instead of following the usual mythology that dictates that Cupid and Aphrodite made Hades fall in love with Persephone, the game's story decides that instead of Hades stealing Persephone, it's Zeus, who then decides to offer Persephone as a gift to Hades. This then kind of creates a rift between the chthonic gods and those of Mount Olympus. This slight shift plays better to the story, as it plays a part in what propels the motivations of those characters in the game. I believe the game makes this change so it is easier to absorb later, trading one complex plot for another slightly less complex plot. It's also important that the player connects with Hades better, because in the end, you're still supposed to work with him. I don't think that modern players would like Hades very much if the game decided to go with the story from the abduction of Persephone. However, despite the differences in the story, it still manages to hit the same beats and end up in the exact same place. Persephone left the underworld to live on the surface that no conflict would come of her while living there. Of course, with this interpretation, the conflict would not come from Demeter. Well, it still would come from Demeter, but it wouldn't come directly from Demeter. But rather, it would come from the idea that Zeus stole Persephone and gave her to Hades, which is why Hades pretends that Nyx is the mother of Zagreus, and perhaps why Zagreus is kept a secret. This also fits into the idea that Persephone had to be on the surface for the earth to remain fertile. In ancient mythology, it is Demeter's anger, again, which drives her to deprive the earth of fertility. And then it becomes Persephone's job to restore this fertility and leave the underworld every couple months. And so, Persephone being on the surface in Hades kind of fits the idea that is already placed within the mythology. Again, in ancient mythology, it's Demeter's anger which drives her to deprive the earth of fertility, and then it becomes Persephone's job to restore this fertility and leave the underworld every couple months. This idea isn't explicitly stated in Hades, or at least I didn't notice it being mentioned, but they did include mention of the pomegranate seed, which makes Persephone stay in the underworld an additional month for every seed that she eats.
What? Singing? Here?
Not every relationship between the gods is about conflict and hate, and Hades makes that pretty clear. Orpheus and Eurydice make an appearance. Their story is seemingly the same that the mythology dictates. Orpheus went to save Eurydice, making it all the way into the underworld and persuading Hades to let them leave. Hades accepted on the terms that Orpheus and Eurydice cannot travel side by side on the journey home, and that until they both leave the underworld, Orpheus cannot look back. Orpheus got to the exit and looked back only to see that she was not out yet, and she was sent back to the underworld. What is interesting is where Hades takes the story from there. Orpheus bears no resemblance to any ancient depictions of him, and in Hades, Orpheus has a very strong appearance. It seems that its hair is all frazzled and puffy, perhaps to replicate more modern rock stars. This change in appearance from a young boy with curly hair to a more sort of rock star look is probably a nod not only to the modern conception of legendary musical talent, but also to the previously mentioned Hades Town, which was a rock-infused musical blending the myth with 20th century rock. Eurydice, on the other hand, is depicted as a tree nymph, which is odd because I personally could not find anything pertaining to any suggestion of her being a nymph at all. But one of the developers of the game's story has openly come out and talked about this change. His justification for the shift is somewhat questionable, stating that Greek mythology often contradicts itself, and this change in the character's design is informed by the myth. This is definitely a topic which is still up for debate, but seeing as he provided sources and cited authenticity as the reason for the change, it's acceptable. It is interesting to note that there was a purpose to them making Eurydice a tree nymph, and it wasn't just an aesthetic choice, like what I was talking about with Zeus in the beginning. Their story in Hades goes that Orpheus becomes the court musician for Hades, and Eurydice returns to Asphodel. Understandably, Orpheus is extremely depressed from his failure, and Eurydice is angry with him. After some time back and forth, they eventually agree to meet, and with some twisting of the terms of Orpheus' contract, the story ends up happy for them. Hades not only took the source material here and transferred it over, but they also sort of continued it, and that's kind of nice. The relationship between Aphrodite and Dionysus is another story which does not necessarily involve hatred or conflict. Hades shapes the narrative slowly and carefully to hint towards some sort of connection. Of course, people, as with many things in this game, who know their myth immediately recognize that there is in fact a purpose for this. It is brought up by Dionysus multiple times, specifically if Zagreus has a boon of Aphrodite already and picks up another one from Dionysus. When picking up the duo boon between Aphrodite and Dionysus, it is finally heavily kind of hinted that there's a connection between the two again. This time it's extremely overt though. This is almost certainly another reference to the mythology in which Dionysus and Aphrodite have had affairs. So it's not only in the main story that they sort of incorporate these different pieces of mythology and different stories, but also within the very small mechanics within the game. There are interactions like this with many of the duo boons and many boons that you pick up and then pick up another gods that sort of play off the mythology, and that is common throughout the whole game. And on the topic of the aforementioned themes, love and hate, is the intersection of the two. Again, it is well suited that Aphrodite represents love, while Ares represents hate. In Greek myth, Ares and Aphrodite are often working in conjunction, such as during the Trojan Wars. This is expressed in the game when picking up Ares and Aphrodite's duo boon.
I think for many of us, dearest, it can come as a surprise to learn that love and war often go hand in hand. Opposite forces, yet this connects them, doesn't it?
With all the drama and infighting, it is easy to believe that all the gods are like this. But Artemis shows us that this is not the case. In Hades, Artemis is described as being a bit of a hermit. She's extremely reserved both in the mythology and in the game. However, one aspect that the developers ignored was her connection to childbirth. It does not play much into the story and doesn't change anything, whether or not she's connected to it in the game or not. But it's worth noting because the developers made a conscious decision not to reference it. There are endless numbers of references and Easter eggs and hidden paths that all hint to one or another aspect of ancient myth. This game is clearly well versed in it. It would take hours for me to explain every single reference I noticed on my many playthroughs, but I compiled the ones that I found the most interesting. The myth isn't a permanent thing, but it is ever-changing. Hades expresses this so well, not only in the progression of Zagreus, but even in the smallest of the side characters, like Orpheus and Eurydice. Even though their story was told in the past, that doesn't mean that there isn't space for new stories in the present. As with any oral tradition, it is incredibly unlikely that Greek mythology was spurred about all at once, unless you believe it's actually real. Rather, it was made and remade and reshaped throughout the generations. By the time that Greek mythology we know today was written down, it was long past its original conception. Not that it matters, however. The result is still an extremely refined piece of literature and tales which are ageless. Hades doesn't just use these tales as lore, but they also use them to inform the tales they are creating for the sake of their story. Modern mythology isn't a recreation of a myth, it's a continuation, and Hades is another epic addition to this chapter of Greek mythology.
However long it takes. Can't hold on